Hey everyone, today I have a guest I'm very excited about. Her name is Bettina Arndt. When I launched the What is a Man campaign, she full-heartedly got behind it. I learned a lot about her. She was wonderful enough to do an interview, and she's got an interesting background, which is amazing. She used to be a feminist up until the 90s, at which point her kind of experiences changed her direction, and she started getting involved in men's issues. And she's taken a lot of heat over her career and her life for doing that. And she's had a lot of courage. And so I'm very happy to have her on today, and pleasure to have you, Bettina. So I'll let you jump right in, give a little background about yourself, and kind of touch on some of the stuff you've had to go through for just standing up for your ideals.
Okay. No, very nice to be here. And I obviously have a very soft spot for you because I think you were very brave taking on the Gillette ad, and a lot of men really appreciated what you did there. Now, in terms of my background, I've actually been probably speaking about men's issues for 30 years on and off. Funnily enough, what I'm best known for is amongst the older generations of Australians is sex. I was the first person in Australia really to be out there in the media trying to encourage people to see sex as a natural part of life. I was a sex therapist. I'd done a clinical psychology degree, and my early career was all about talking about sex in the media. I was on radio and television, and I was involved in a little magazine which was all about promoting adult sex education. And it was interesting because I was a feminist, and I chose to do work. One of the reasons I chose sexuality was it was a great area to work in if you wanted to help women. I thought, if we're going to improve women's lives, the bedroom seemed a pretty good place to start. Because, everybody was pretty ignorant about sex in the 1970s. But in some ways, women were particularly, they really didn't have the knowledge they needed about their own bodies to begin to discover themselves sexually. And so that was my initial cause. And I went out there to help women learn to reach orgasm. I did a thesis on teaching women to reach orgasm, which was then not the sort of thing you talked about in the early 1970s. But what happened to me is, so I'm out there talking about sex, and I was the person everybody came to learn more about sex, and inevitably men started to talk to me. Everywhere I went, I'd be bailed up in a corner with some bloke telling me about his erection problems or whatever it was. And I started to learn what it was like to be on the other side of the fence. I'd only ever really thought about women's issues, and I'd done this research with women, but I realized things were very different for men, and I really started to understand a lot more about what it felt like to be a male in a sexual relationship. I used to do a lot of public speaking, and I remember going out and talking once to a group of men about the trouble women have saying no to sex. Now, that is something they don't have trouble with anymore. But we were still coming out of the era where sex was a wifely duty, and wives often felt reluctant to turn their husbands down, And so I was talking to the men about that, and I said to this audience of men, do you ever have trouble saying no? And a young guy got up and said, if I ever said no, my penis would beat me to death. It was a real insight for me. Here was a bloke saying, he couldn't imagine knocking it back. Yeah. that was not his problem at that point. Those sorts of experiences gradually added up, and I taught more and more to men. And of course, if you talk to men about sex, they then start talking to you about all the other difficult aspects of their lives, particularly their relationships. And that's how I got involved in the whole issue of what was happening to men after divorce. This is 40 years ago. Yeah. I started listening to men about who were struggling to see their children after divorce. And I started to gradually, so I did 10 years really focusing on sex. And then I went out and talked about broader social issues and wrote for a lot of the big Australian magazines and newspapers about, relationships between men and women and gender issues. And that was one of the issues I started to really focus on, what was happening in family law. How was it that our family law courts were so tilted against men? men, that women had absolute license. They were automatically given custody of children and were in a position to just deny men the dad's contact with those kids. They could move anywhere they liked in Australia, or overseas with those children. I mean, it was just extraordinary. And I started writing about this, and then one day I got a letter out of the blue from a judge who was retiring from the family court. And he said, "You're totally right. The family court had only been established about 10 years before that." And he said, "We made a big mistake. We gave too much power to the custodial parent, who was almost always the woman, and that power is absolutely being exploited by some women." Yeah. Anyway, he gave a whole series of articles about that to me, which was pretty exciting breakthrough. A judge speaking out and saying false accusations are being used constantly to deny children access to their fathers, all that stuff. So this was, late 70s, early 80s. I was already really delving into this territory. And even though I was employed as a feature writer and an opinion writer for the big newspapers, I very much would tend to present the male point of view. And I suppose in a sense, I've always been interested in what aren't we allowed to talk about? I'm like a moth to the flames, and that's what attracted me to sex, in a sense, that when I started talking about sex, it was at a time when talking about sex publicly was really taboo. And here was another big area where there was an enormous taboo. The whole media was dominated by women. This, women's liberation, women's needs, women's wants. All the social writing about social issues, just about, was done by women, presenting their point of view, and men's perspective on all these issues just didn't get a look in. And so, if I had an opinion column, I wasn't going to spend half of that 400 words writing about, well, this is what the women think, this is what the men think. I was interested in getting the view out there that wasn't being talked about. So more and more, I got known as presenting a male point of view on all manner of issues. And it became more and more a deliberate strategy for me, increasing my unpopularity in certain circles. I mean, I had mighty battles with my editors. I mean, I was employed full-time as one of the, I suppose, the highest paid feature writers at that time. And yet my editors were often women who really didn't like what I was writing about. Mm-hmm. Just trying to think of, I know one example was so I'm writing about childcare, and I'm writing about mothers' preferences for looking after their children when they're tiny. In Australia, we're very lucky. We have still, most Australian mums are able to work part-time when they have young children. And that's always been their choice. Very few want to put infants into childcare. They prefer to stay home until their children are, at least one or two. And I think it's been a wonderful thing, and it's a very important aspect of Australian society. Anyway, I was writing about this and saying, this is the preference of Australian women. And my female editor said, well, I just don't believe that. None of my friends think that, and she's a woman who'd put her child into childcare at as an infant. And it was true of all the really ambitious women who are starting to run our newspapers. They make different decisions about their lives from the decisions of ordinary women. And I was out there not only representing men, but talking about what women want, what ordinary women want, not what the women who are running
who are trying to achieve perhaps the highest positions in their.
And they are making decisions which are very different from what most mums, what most women in Australia particularly are lucky enough to be able to work out. So they shape their career around their children. And I mean, even our doctors, look at these medical students who are obviously amongst the brightest of all our young women and most ambitious young women. They went into medicine in droves, 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And upturned the whole profession, because all of a sudden doctors didn't want to work full time anymore, because these huge numbers of women coming in. And most of our doctors in Australia work part-time. Most of our female doctors in Australia work part-time for most of their lives. And they work in sessions, and they do, if they're working as general practitioners, they fit their jobs around their families, just as women do across the board. And, that's the sort of thing people didn't want to talk about, because the feminist push, of course, is that all women want to work as hard as men, want to take their place beside men. They don't want special, that sort of argument. And so I started taking on the feminists on that sort of issue as well.
Something I find fascinating in terms of what you're saying is that you got involved in this. I'm sorry about the beeps that come up. I haven't been
No problem.
on my computer, but you got involved in kind of switching your positions, or at least broadening your positions very early on, when I would say that society was not as fundamental in its positions on these subjects as they are now. Yep. And so the changes that have happened in terms of the narratives around men, masculinity, toxic masculinity, in terms of fatherhood, the idea of fatherhood, custody, which has existed for a very, very long time. That one, for sure. And I've noticed you also kind of have touched on how cancer is looked at between men and women, domestic abuse. Have you noticed a big shift from the 90s, perhaps like a downward shift? I don't want to say downward. I'll let you say exactly what
I'll say downward. No question is it downward. I mean, we've seen, okay, I mean, I can't get published what I was writing about 10 years ago, let alone, 15 years ago. I mean, and it's partly because I was in a very strong position, employed full-time on newspapers. I was brought in to a very PC newspaper to help create diversity. Funnily enough, diversity of opinion, which is a very unpopular thing these days. But we happened to have an editor who was keen to have, a broad range of views on all the issues. And I was brought in to present that and to challenge the orthodoxy of most of the journalists. And I was extremely unpopular on that paper amongst the staff, but at least I had editors who were absolutely backing me so I could get my articles in. That wouldn't happen anymore. I've absolutely been and it's partly that I have, as a result of fighting that fight, I've become more outspoken about men's issues. And I made a very deliberate decision once I got out of full-time journalism to spend the rest of my career advocating for men. I mean, and I started making YouTube videos, and this is what I do. And I go out there and campaign for men's rights. And of course now I can't, and that means I've been absolutely frozen out of all our mainstream media. We have a big public, your PBS, we have a public broadcaster, the ABC, which receives huge funding, government money, but taxpayers' money, and they have become more and more stridently anti-male. And I used to be on their programs every week, and they wouldn't have been near them now, any of their programs. And that's what's happened in Australia. The media has become more and more controlled by the feminists, and we have key women in positions of power in all our major institutions who are freezing out any proper discussion of men's issues.
Well, it seems like it's become even so extreme that even within the feminist movement itself, any diversity of opinion is, any non-hyper progressive, this is today's narrative, anything like that. J.K. Rowling saying what she just said, she was met with unbelievable resistance. And I'm not condoning or not condoning, this has nothing to do with my opinion, but opinions should be able to be expressed and challenged and debated. I feel very strongly about this. And it's just fascinating how you've kind of done this your whole career, so you've been exposed to the slow change. But from my perspective, maybe coming into it later and kind of just sometimes as a man, just saying something and being like, you shouldn't have an opinion on this, you're a man, and slowly hearing those things and toxic, it's been kind of like a snowball effect. I've wondered to myself what the incentive of the movement is at this point to kind of shut down dialogue.
And I do think the feminist movement has been hijacked by very specific interests and has become less and less tolerant, as you say, on any number of issues. What's their motivation? I mean, I'm sure it's about power as much as anything else. That the people who have a particular opinion on a whole range of issues get in a position of power and want to hang on to that. Why they are so intolerant of diversity amongst, of diverse ideas from women is, I mean, it was one of the big questions, really. Yeah, so yes, it's an interesting question. I don't have a simple answer. There's some aspects of feminism where their motivation is very clear. I mean, the domestic violence one is an area which I've been following for many years, and what's obvious there is the issue at the heart of that is it's one of their big cash cows. Do you know about Erin Pizzey, the famous Erin Pizzey is a famous um, men's rights activist who started off. She's an English woman. She started off. She's famous for in the 1970s setting up the first refuge for women. So she sets up this refuge and then finds that the women coming into the refuge were often violent. Not all, but some were violent to other women and violent to their children. And she started speaking out about this and saying violence is a two-way street. Not only men are violent, women can be violent too. And she actually had a violent mother, so she knew all about that.
Mm-hmm.
When she started, this is after the first wave of feminism in that period was starting to die down. The feminists were getting, they'd had this enormous influx of money, and then they realized they were starting to get into trouble, and they seized upon domestic violence as their next means of earning money. It's an apple pie issue. No one can attack domestic violence. The minute you start talking about domestic violence, everyone falls into line. Yeah. And here was this woman saying, no, men can be victims too. Women can be violent too. Her dog was killed. She had death threats. She had to leave England.
Wow. Just for saying
that. Yeah, amazing story. She's a wonderful woman. Erin Pizzey, Pizzey. Anyway, so she nailed it. She said that the domestic violence issue has been a wonderful means of raising income from feminists, employs literally hundreds of thousands of women across the world. In Australia, we have an enormous domestic violence industry, organisations in every state receiving vast amounts of funding, and their role is to put out anti-male propaganda. Their role is to disguise the true statistics about violence, to pretend violence is all one way, to constantly ask for more money. And then most of that money doesn't go to refuges, doesn't actually go to helping victims. It goes to producing horrible videos and television programs, presenting men always as the violent person in the family. Just recently, of course, with the coronavirus crisis, immediately they were saying there was going to be threats to women from being locked up with violent men, and they got vast amounts more funding from that. And yet we've got the figures coming through now showing very clearly there was no spike in domestic violence during that period.
I saw a lot of headlines coming out during coronavirus because it disproportionately was killing men to women. And there was ads kind of trying to say like, yeah, it kills more men than women, but then women something, or like, they was trying to create another problem, like even around that headline, that they had to report. They had to.
Women are the ones losing all the jobs. Women are the ones who are really suffering. We have one of our best known feminists in Australia recently tweeted that it was a joke. I mean, jokingly, apparently, that the coronavirus wasn't killing enough men. What a shame. It was just and she actually finally was forced to. She lost a grant that she'd been given for making such an outrageous statement. But the whole feminist discussion around this issue was outrageous, as always. And the governments, the politicians, the bureaucrats won't stand up to it.
Well, that's
the thing. Yeah.
It's the scary thing is that we are slowly, and it's why I'm moving forward. I'm going to find as many people to put on this channel who are willing to speak out, and people like yourself who've done it your whole lives. But one thing I am fundamentally fearful of is that these movements, all the ones that kind of rely on political correctness, feminist movement, if you challenge them, you're a sexist. If anything that there's no more freedom of speech involved around these things. And it keeps going one step further. Every time something happens, it goes one step further, to the point where talk that 5 years ago would have been considered very extreme, something like saying the coronavirus, it's too bad it's not killing more men. In 5 years, that kind of language will be acceptable. People will, we're allowing more and more, and most of society doesn't agree with it, but the vocal minority is so vocal. And the politicians and the media and the companies are all so scared because they see these people speaking out, that if no one's speaking out in opposition to things that are irrational, there's just irrational conversations taking place nowadays that most men and women do not agree with. And yet we're allowing that to become the norm. We're allowing that to become the dialogue of which we base our reality around.
And if you speak out, you get destroyed. And then it makes other people even more nervous. What's going on?
Putting my company at risk just by, having interviews, putting my company at risk just by hearing ideas from other people. And it's such a crazy world we've created where my livelihood, I have to put my livelihood, my business, my family at risk to have honest dialogue about what's going on in the world. You've had to put yourself at risk many times. And I know you've been vilified many times, and they'll purposefully change things that people have said just to create their own narrative, and they'll vilify people and they'll cancel people. We live in a cancel culture. This all stems to a much bigger issue, obviously.
As I said, I've got more out there, and I suppose a classic example of where I really attracted a lot of negative attention from the feminists was I deliberately went out on campuses last year speaking out about the fake rape crisis, this manufactured idea of there being rapists crawling around all the university campuses. And of course, the figures that the feminists promote on this issue are totally wrong and have been shown to be wrong in America and in Australia. Luckily, obviously every rape is one too many. Any sexual assault has to be taken very seriously. But luckily, our campuses are very safe places for most young women. They're certainly far safer than a lot of communities in America. And being on a university campus is a very good place for a young woman to be. And this has all been manufactured. And in America, of course, what happened was Obama required all publicly funded universities to adjudicate rape, to set up kangaroo courts to make decisions about sexual assault and sexual misconduct. And I'm sure, Elan, this history that it's led to so many young men being investigated and accused by these tribunals on university campuses, their whole lives derailed, they're thrown out of colleges, and there's been over 200 cases where the universities and the colleges have been successfully sued by the families of these guys for failure to protect the due process rights. And I went out last year, same is happening in Australia, where there's an absolute copycat feminist movement working on campuses in Australia. They've set up regulations at all our universities to do exactly the same thing. Totally unfair, biased investigations against men who've been accused of sexual assault. They have the capacity to steal this young guy's degree. They could just remove the degree from him, which has cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of his life. So I went out on campuses and I had protesters screaming and yelling. We had to have the riot squad to protect me from these violent protests at Sydney University. And of course, but the whole goal was for me to draw attention to what's going on here. And the fact that we are allowing our universities to be controlled by feminists who are determined to, use this as an example. It's interesting. Joe Biden said categorically in America that he wanted the universities to be examples. That's why he was behind the idea of these tribunals being set up. He was one of the major people promoting that in America under Obama. And he said it was a good thing for that the universities should be setting an example to the rest of the country about how sexual assault should be treated. Meaning, yes, let's have a totally unfair system, a believe the victim system where the male's legal rights are tossed out the window. And so he was promoting that. And anyway, in Australia, the same thing happened. Was involved in all these protests. And that's one of the things that this year led to me being absolutely demolished.
On that, like the whole believe all women kind of campaign. Now, I don't think anyone, whether you're on the men's side, like rights, you work in that space, or the women's side, I don't think anyone wants people who are victims of sexual assault to not be believed, wants people who are, we all want people to be able to feel safe speaking out It's such a sensitive topic that's kind of where the power in that movement comes from, because you can't say anything, because then you're putting down victims according to them, and then there's no dialogue around it. When all people are saying is, hey, we cannot become a society that drops due process, regardless of the crime, regardless of whether it's a violent crime, regardless of, someone who murders someone, we still have due process. That's just the foundation of our system, and it's so important. And on that, I find the hypocrisy behind all of it was something that really bothered me, because when Kavanaugh came, the whole issue with Kavanaugh, but the whole believe all women, Alyssa Milano, and all these people fighting, and no due process. He's guilty. He's been accused. He's guilty. He shouldn't be. But then Biden is accused, and she's out there defending Biden. She's out there switching her narrative completely. So it's hard for me to believe that they care about the thing they're actually promoting. It's more a political tool, because you can't tell me believe all women, except when it's Joe Biden and he's running for president against someone you don't like. You can't tell me it's believe all women, and then when Keith Ellison is accused, or anyone who's on the left is accused, you guys are suddenly out running and protecting these people. That's why we have due process as a foundational thing. And I have a very sad story. When I did the Gillette ad, a mother wrote in and she told me that her son had been accused, was innocent, proven innocent, but by that point he was such a pariah. And even with the innocence, he was allowed back in school, but he had lost a year of school, was depressed, drove him deeper into depression. He ended up committing suicide.
That's what's really dangerous. I mean, on our university campuses and in American colleges, young women are being told, if you have sex and you've had anything to drink, that was rape. There's no responsibility for you, and that all the responsibility lies on the man's shoulders, and you could accuse him of rape, because that's what it was. I mean, no question, you cannot consent if you had anything to drink. I talked this week to a young man in Australia who came to me to say he's been accused of sexual assault, and it was typical. They were both really drunk, very confusing picture. That after 6 weeks, he discovered she'd made a complaint the next day to the university, and he was never told this was happening, and he was excluded. He's already been excluded from attending the university, and I've got a barrister to try to help him. And I mean, this is going on across Australia, across America. That the Trump administration had promised to properly investigate this and to restore due process rights to the accused. And you've just had a big investigation in America where Betsy DeVos announced with great fanfare about 2 weeks ago that she was introducing some changes to the Title IX regulations, which underpin the tribunals in the States. And I just did a video actually with Janice Fiamengo. I don't know whether you know Janice. If you haven't come across Janice, you must interview her. She's one of the most really impressive men's rights activists from Canada. She's a professor of English, and she's read through the nearly 2,000-page document that was produced by the Education Department justifying the changes that have been made. It's a total sellout. They've made tiny little changes. They haven't restored due process rights. That the guys are now allowed a lawyer. Whoopee! I mean, I suppose that's a start. Yeah. They are now allowed, through a third party, to ask the accuser some questions. I mean, there's tiny little changes, and all the rest stays in place. I mean, it's still a grossly unfair system. Your American colleges are still required to adjudicate this sexual conduct rather than, obviously this is a criminal matter. It should be being handled by the police and the courts.
I agree fully. It is a criminal matter.
The Trump administration has sold out and told universities they have to keep doing this. It's just craziness. And the same is happening here,
I think it's because it's so scary to talk about, because even now we're talking about it, and in my head, I'm like, I hope no one takes this, that we're devaluing what a rape victim goes through, or that a rape victim, I want to constantly repeat it because I think it's so important, because it's such a sensitive. I saw a study that came out that showed that society responded stronger in terms of like a visceral response, especially men, they were showing different videos of crimes. And men responded unbelievably strong to rape negatively. Like they wanted to kill the person who was the rapist. The only crime they responded stronger to was not murder, was child molestation. And so we all inherently do not agree with this. And I wish that was the starting point with these discussions, and that just asking for due process is not the same thing as saying we don't agree with this. You know what I mean? We all agree that people who do it should be, as Ben Shapiro said, castrated or whatever you want to do to them. I'm all for it. People who commit that crime. But we need to live in a society where due process exists, where you are innocent until proven guilty, for many reasons. I'll say one that's very important was because traditionally racism in America allowed these exact situations to be taken advantage of, where Black men went to prison unjustly with accusations from white women of rape, of anything, with no due process, no nothing. And if that's the thing that as a society we've become against, then we still have to be against it in all cases. There's a reason why that standard exists. And so,
you know what's really interesting is that the men most at risk of being falsely accused on campuses are Black guys, people from different racial groups, and that's something no one ever talks about. But it's understandable. I mean, you've got an Asian student, people who aren't necessarily part of the dominant culture in that college are more likely not to understand, to get the messages right, more likely to have their behavior misinterpreted. And that's, there's interesting research showing that they're particularly prone to ending up being accused in these situations. We're not talking about a stranger leaping out of bushes with a knife between his teeth. We're talking about date rape. We're talking about that whole confusing business of consent, where, there's all this fuss about trying to introduce the idea of affirmative, enthusiastic consent, where the man has to ask permission every inch of the way. And we all know that actually is very difficult. I mean, it's a nice ideal for a guy to constantly say, can I kiss you? Can I put my... But any man who went through a dating situation doing that all the time would be at risk of being seen as a total nerd,
Yeah.
It's a very difficult territory for men.
I think at this point we've just kind of confused men, and I see it in, niece, nephews, just kind of the whole dialogue around this, speaking to younger men, that they don't know kind of what to do in this situation. And they're no longer pursuing women, a lot of them, sexually, because they're uncomfortable. And yeah, the articles that come out saying that you have to enthusiastically get a yes every 3 minutes or every time anything changes. And then what if you don't? Are you committing sexual assault? That's what we're telling people by definition. If you don't do this, then you're doing something wrong. And so there's a fear there, obviously, from the male perspective of, okay, if I don't do this every minute, then
also that's assuming women want that. And we know a lot of women don't want that. I mean, if I was with a man who was saying, can I? I mean, I just think, what an idiot. I mean, I, like many women, want to be seduced. I like the idea of a man, trying to see if I'm interested and reading my body signals. And obviously, if I'm quite capable of saying, no, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
But if I want him to kiss me and see how I respond. I mean, this idea that all women want that constant checking in is totally wrong.
I think,
and we're out there, so the women are out there constantly confusing men because we have different ideas from the views that feminists think we should have.
Yes, and I think again it's a subject that most people, both men and women in society, don't want to talk about just because it's scary. And I think that when things started happening to that comedian who had no idea that the experience he had with the woman was uncomfortable, and she came out and started publicly accusing him, and he said she never said no. We obviously misread the situation differently, and I'm very sorry. And in me in that situation, if I was with a woman and the next day she told me, hey, I don't appreciate what you did. I didn't say no, but I was uncomfortable. I will honestly come out and would have been, I totally misread the situation. It would make me feel terrible, but I don't think that would make the person a actual criminal, in my opinion. unless obviously
He was a dumb root. He was a dumb root. I mean, you know, for her to turn around and say, I didn't like the way he made love to me or maybe had sex with me, I will disgrace him publicly. I mean, it's just outrageous behavior from a woman. What the
yeah.
hell? If she didn't want to go there, if she was incapable of saying no at the time, she went to his apartment because he was a well-known guy. I mean, you could see all the elements there. I think women across, so many women are behaving in a way that they're absolutely letting down other women. I'm ashamed of being a woman when women like that behave in that sort of way and deliberately destroy the lives of men.
Well, beyond that, we're destroying the lives of families, of women, everyone. Like, because what the end result here is that, like I said, people are not having sex anymore at much lower rates.
The MGTOW is flourishing. I mean, I think it's not surprising there are more and more men saying, women are too dangerous. Why would I risk all the things I've worked for and get involved with a woman who can, is always in a position to just pull the rug out from under me. I'm encouraged as a man to get really involved with my children, but she can decide at any moment that she doesn't want me in the lives of my children, and she can make false accusations. She can deny me access to those kids and get away with it. She can take my house. She can take half my assets. I think women are a very risky prospect for any sane man these days.
Well, I think that there's a sad aspect to that, because I think one of the most beautiful things you can have in your life is a wonderful relationship, and to steer away from that. It's so interesting how that message, also kind of the breakdown of the nuclear family, has infiltrated every single other organization.
I remember Obama very early in his presidency made a very strong speech about the damage to the black community of these fatherless families, and he never said another word about that.
No, he got railed for that. Yeah, he got.
Yeah, that's right. And yet, of course, because he was quite right, and there's abundant research showing that.
Yes.
And yet, this is one of the key issues we're not allowed to talk about. There's just so many areas which have now, as you say, there's a politically prescribed view that you're allowed to have, and you're not allowed to talk about the truth of what's going on here.
Well, within it, it's become completely kind of contradictory from the jump from third wave to, I guess, would be fourth wave feminism, where in third wave feminism, in my experience of kind of researching it, the kind of dynamic between men and women still exists in terms of there is masculinity, there is femininity. And now in fourth wave feminism, these are entirely social constructs, and men and women are virtually identical in every way other than what they're exposed to in society. Men are not physically stronger biologically. Men are stronger because society has pushed them into these jobs. Men are not different because of testosterone. It's not biological. Men are entirely different because of social constructs. A complete denial of any biological differences between men and women, explained away entirely with we push men to be this way. Denies tens of thousands of years of evolution and kind of every culture in the world developing to have these kind of social dynamics. But it's always fascinating, I guess, and that's where the thing with J.K. Rowling might come up, because she might still be a little bit stuck in the third wave, and the fourth wave is kind of coming at her and saying, sorry, that doesn't exist anymore. But I mean, it's become very confusing, because if masculinity doesn't exist other than a social construct and men are virtually identical to women, then how do all these narratives simultaneously exist? They can't.
And where does the trans stuff fit in there? The gender fluidity argument. I mean, that's been so entertaining. Watching the feminists try to react to the idea that anyone can call themselves a woman and take on the privileges of being a woman, whether it's going into a woman's prison instead of a male prison, or going into a female toilet. I mean, and of course the feminists haven't known what to do with this. I mean, I'm pleased to see some of them taking this on, but for a long time they just lay down and let this fierce trans lobby walk all over them. Anyway, so that's been one of the more entertaining aspects of recent identity politics, I think.
But again, it's very upsetting, because a male prisoner did say he identifies as a female, went to a female prison, and he was a prisoner who was arrested for sexual assault and rape, and sexually assaulted 22 more women in prison before they took him out and put him in.
I know.
There are certain realities again, that I feel we need to, as a society, be able to talk about. And this is, again, not to deny people identifying as what they want. You know, me personally, I don't want to get into my personal politics, but if someone is happier by me calling them a she or whatever they like, to me, it doesn't change my life. I'm more than happy to accommodate them. But when it comes to where we put people into prisons, you know, and I've tried to have this conversation, and again, it's a tough conversation for people to have because they're stuck in a rock and a hard place. What's the right answer? Well, a male rapist should not go to a female prison because he now identifies as female, because he can still, we have the research to show.
And you know, athletes shouldn't be allowed to define themselves as women and beat those poor little girls who spent 10 years of their lives training to win a particular race. I mean, it's just madness.
Well, it works.
And the worst thing of all is this medical intervention with children who are confused. We've just had a lot of public discussion in Australia about the fact that a lot of the kids who are gender confused are being sent along to clinics and having puberty blockers and all sorts of other medical interventions are actually autistic. Over 50% are autistic, and This is really dangerous stuff. These are kids who have problems and where they get taken up by this lobby group and pushed in a particular direction, and it's actually child abuse. We're going to see massive legal suits against the medical professionals, the medical and the psychologists and so on, who pushed parents into allowing this to happen to their children. I think
I'm not scared to say it. I'm very uncomfortable with the notion of giving a 10-year-old, 11-year-old puberty blockers. You know, if there's research that will show that the suicide rates go down, I would reevaluate it. But the research...
The suicide rates, look, that's one of the great myths in this whole discussion. Suicide rates of people who've had sex change operations are no better than people who haven't had them.
I've read that as well.
And it's a very complex area. I mean, someone who's had a sex change operation... My background as a sex therapist, I had a lot of interaction with people who were gender confused, people who had, you know, trans, whatever, all those different sorts of areas. And I mean, it's a really tough life, whether you've had a sex change operation or whether you haven't. I mean, all of these variations are problematic in terms of future relationships. And that's what people don't talk about. The fact that it's not hard enough for most of us to find stable relationships, let alone a person who's had a sex change operation. So that what are the chances of them establishing a loving, caring relationship with someone new after that's happened? They often face lifetime medical problems. The sex change operations are usually terrible. Have you ever seen a penis that's been constructed?
No.
I mean, they're really, a lot of the operations are failures. And if you look at the medical research, you'll find that most people who've been through that sort of procedure are really unhappy about the results. And they have to have constant operations to repair things that aren't working properly, urinary problems, infections, you name it. And these constructed penises are really, I don't know quite how to describe it. They get very poor example of, you know, that's not what the man was hoping to end up, or the new man was hoping to end up with. And they're deeply disappointed, a lot of these people, once they have their operation, because it's not what they expected it to be. And I mean, it's all online. People should go and have a good look at this. The research on what happens after sex change operations needs to be studied.
Well, I would hope it's more studied. I would hope it's more studied and more studied in a non-biased.
But it's not. It's repressed. You see, this is the point. No, the trans movement doesn't want any proper discussion of the medical problems associated with these operations. They're pushing and trying to encourage kids towards. I mean, they don't want any proper discussion of whether people are actually happier after those sort of procedures. And they're suppressing a lot of the medical evidence about the risks of delaying puberty, the risks of these medical interventions we're using with kids, let alone what happens even when adults have a lot of these procedures.
First of all, if someone's an adult, I believe they should be able to do whatever they want, but I believe they should be able to do it from an informed standpoint based on...
Absolutely.
Now, beyond that, I think as a society, we should, as a society, always be open to whatever helps a group of people, as long as it's ethical. So if sex change did show that it drastically reduced suicide, I'd be very pro it. But I like you, haven't found necessarily the research that showed a reduction in suicide rates pre and post surgery, which is upsetting because I wish that was more given to the people who are about to go through a very hard. It's a very hard surgery. It's a very dangerous and hard surgery. All surgeries are dangerous and all surgeries are hard. This one, is much harder than I think a lot of people go into it expecting. And again, that's because of the taboo around discussing these issues.
But the new taboo, Ilan, is, there's a guy called Quentin Van Meter, who's a professor of medicine from America, who was in Australia. I was actually MC of an event he gave here. And he's been talking about what the research really shows in this area for many years. If they want to go to my YouTube channel, they'll see the video I did with him. And he presents all the evidence of how the medical profession has been captured by the trans lobby and has suppressed the research showing the sort of problems we've been discussing, showing the truth about suicide rates, all these other issues. And it's just extraordinary that all your big medical organizations have been cowered into presenting only one view, a view that fits in with what the ideology of the trans movement. And then they're suppressing 50 years of research by key researchers who've been really studying this whole area.
Yeah, and science should never work.
Very scary.
Yeah, I believe that anything to do with health and anything to do with science should be completely objective. Anything to do with depression, suicide, it has to be objective. It can't be based in bias that idealistically we like this more, idealistically we like this more, politically this fits our narrative. And I sadly have noticed a trend. I'm not well versed enough on the trans issues to actually speak on the research. I know you're far more educated on it. And I'll gladly share the link, by the way.
I'll send that to you.
In the description below, so if anyone wants to see it, it'll be in the below. If I can make a call to action of anything, it's to advocate for a more objective society and advocate that we can express these ideas and that we can talk about these ideas. Bettina has done it. She's taken the chance her whole life, and she's always gone against the grain. And it's been a hard path for her, but she's never shied away. And it takes a lot of courage. And I hope that anyone watching this can find the courage to not step away from searching for that same kind of truth in their lives.
Just be warned, my enemies have taken over my Wikipedia page. I just want to mention the fact that I had was given an honours award by the government earlier this year for promoting gender equity through advocacy for men. And that unfortunately gave license to half of Australia to start attacking me, and I was subject to an enormous media pile-on. And one of the things that happened as a result of that is the Wikipedia is now full of lies and misinformation about me. So please don't take any notice of that. We can put up information about. I have a website. That's a much better place to go if you want to find more about my work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bettina. Thank you for always advocating for these issues.
Thank you.